eligible U.S. citizens should be able to register and to vote without undue obstacles. In 2009, ALEC created some proposed model legislation which included the requirement that voters at the poll, voters who are already registered, but when they go to the poll, they need to show a valid ID, because voter fraud is so rampant in the United States, and they created the fiction that there are thousands of people illegally voting. Well, because of that hype, at least 164 restrictive voting laws were introduced in 41 states since 2011, and 33 states have passed new laws requiring voter ID at the polls. Now, I realize that ALEC claims to have abandoned the elections task force because it was part of the public safety task force that created Stand Your Ground. However, the damage is already done because all of these laws are already in the hopper and people think voter fraud is rampant. Now, if you have to show a voter ID at the poll, even though you're already registered, the only fraud that it can prevent is the fraud of me going to the polls and claiming to be someone else registered in that precinct who has not yet voted. That's the only fraud it's going to prevent. And that is so rampant that in 7 years there were 9 accusations across the entire U.S. of people doing that. So this is definitely a solution to a problem that did not exist. We do not object as League of Women Voters to seeing that non-citizens don't vote. We aren't against reasonable ID being required to register. We're not against reasonable ID being required at the polls. We're not against Utah's current voter ID law, which passed in 2009, because it allows voters to use 21 different kinds of ID to prove their identity and residence. So it is something almost anybody should be able to come up with. The problem with the ALEC model legislation is that in so many states where it's passed, the kinds of ID that is acceptable is so narrow that a lot of people aren't going to have it even though they're already registered. In Texas, the Secretary of State estimates that 600,000 currently registered voters are not going to have the required ID in the fall when they go to the polls. And the Brennan Center for Justice estimates that 21 million U.S. voting age citizens do not have the ID that will be required at their polls to vote in the fall. So who doesn't have a driver's license issued by their state or a voter ID card, current and up to date, or a passport? Well, 18% of Americans older than 65 don't. 25% of American citizens who are black don't have that ID. 20% of Asian American citizens do not have that voter ID. 19% of Latino American citizens do not have that voter ID. Who else? The disabled who are never going to drive, the poor who don't own a vehicle, the people who move from place to place so they can't keep a current residence on a driver's license, and young people and students who are going between place to place. So there are a lot of people who don't have that ID, and interestingly in Kansas, if you're a married woman and haven't changed your name, you need your birth certificate to prove your name, but it's not your name if you've taken your husband's name, so you're in a catch-22. The Wisconsin governor closed 10 motor vehicle offices required to go get your ID as soon as voter ID legislation was passed. So the effect of voter suppression laws is to restrict specific unnamed minorities. But the Republican House leader in Pennsylvania explained exactly what that means when he said, The voter ID law will help Romney win the election. In other words, he's explaining that these are minorities who don't usually vote Republican. So, can stricter voter ID laws influence the coming election? Certainly 21 million voters being ineligible could change the election. 16 states with new stricter voting laws account for 79% of the electoral votes that will choose the president in November. Additional voter ID laws, in addition to voter ID laws, voter suppression, I'm just going to name a couple of ways from Florida. We've watched Florida purge their voter records this spring, and in Miami, 98% of the 500 voters who went to protest being kicked off the roll were actually legal voters. 98% were legal. And even the Secretary of State in Florida agrees that the list he used was outdated and inaccurate, and he better find a different list. In Florida, they've also changed a decades-long practice that you can vote the Sunday before the election, which was the way 30% of black people in Florida voted. They went as church groups to the polls on Sunday to vote. Other ways of restricting voting is by having too few poll workers, so if you get in line, the line is going to be hours long, or shortening early voting times, or requiring earlier registration, or lengthening your residency requirements, or having too little publicity telling you where to vote, or the ID you need to vote, or, as in Utah, holding the primary in June when nobody cares. In Utah's last election in 2008, only 38.6% of registered voted in November. The League of Women Voters has a century of nonpartisan voter advocacy under its belt. We register voters, we hold Meet the Candidate debates, we publish an online voters guide, and especially at a time when we see in the Arab countries people willing to fight for the death to get rid of dictators, we value our democracy, and we think it's based on every eligible citizen being able to vote.